In 2010, Ozzy Osbourne volunteered to be evaluated by doctors. They wanted to learn, given everything he put himself through with drugs and alcohol and everything else, why he wasn't dead. When the results came back, it was discovered that his genome had mutated from all the drugs he'd taken. His DNA contained variants that no scientists had ever seen before. Things that would have killed a normal person were just shrugged off because of Ozzy's genetic makeup. The findings were so abnormal that they were presented at a prestigious medical conference, positioning Ozzy as an anomalous medical specimen. And this is how Ozzy managed to make it to age 76. Keith Moon, another madman, didn't have these genes, which is why he died at 32. Same thing with Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, Jimi Hendrix, and scores of other hard-partying rockers who died young. Now consider Keith Richards. As I sit here, he is 82. He's still playing guitar, still recording, and still plays live with the Rolling Stones. If Ozzy was a medical curiosity, I don't know what Keith is. And it's not just the drugs and alcohol. It's all the other things he's done and gone through. I'm Alan Cross, and this is episode 65 of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. I call this episode The Life and Crimes of Keith Richards, Part 1. Keith Richards has been through so much for so long that he's a meme. There's one that has him rocking a baby Willie Nelson to sleep. There's another one that shows him playing guitar to Adam and Eve. And conventional wisdom about nuclear war is that when it's all over, there will probably only be two survivors on the planet: cockroaches and Keith Richards. You've probably got your favorite meme. Along the way, Keith has become one of the most admired and influential guitarists in the history of rock and roll. It's fine, but given all he's been through, how is he not dead? Let me lay out the facts, and maybe you can figure it out. Some of what you're about to hear was covered in episode 31, the arrest record of the Rolling Stones. This time, though, we're going to focus entirely on Keith. Keith Richards was an only child, born in Kent on December 18, 1943. Dad was a factory worker who was wounded in Normandy. One set of grandparents were musicians and gave him his first guitar. He eventually got into Elvis Presley, and specifically his guitarist Scotty Moore. He was a choir boy for a while, and his group once performed for Queen Elizabeth. Keith was not a good student, and after he was expelled, he ended up at art college, which in the British school system was the place of last resort. And even then, he spent more time playing guitar than going to class. His main field of study was Chuck Berry. On October 17, 1961, Keith was on the platform at Dartford train station in Kent when he noticed another kid with a bunch of R&B records under his arm. That was Mick Jagger, and they bonded immediately. Over the next few months, Keith and Mick ended up together in a band called the Blue Boys. Keith dropped out of school, moved to London with Mick and another kid named Brian Jones, which outraged his father. They would not speak again for 20 years. The Rolling Stones were formed soon after, and in mid-1963 got a deal with Decca Records, which might have been feeling the sting after rejecting the Beatles a few months earlier. Another kid, Andrew Loog Oldham, served as their manager, and for a while, he convinced Keith Richards to become Keith Richard to avoid confusion with pop star Cliff Richards. And that stage name confusion lasted all the way until 1978. Oldham was also the guy who came up with the idea of positioning the Rolling Stones as the bad boys of British rock and roll. If the Beatles were polished, wholesome, and fun, the Stones were dirty and menacing and dangerous. This worked extremely well with the British tabloids playing up this image with every chance they got. One of the first bits of press along these lines was a 1964 edition of the weekly British music paper Melody Maker. The headline read, "Would you let your sister go out with a Rolling Stone?" And it was accompanied by some photos of the band sneering at the camera. This tactic worked brilliantly. Parents freaked out, which only made kids more curious and devoted. The first recorded incident of Keith getting into trouble with the law was in 1964. He got into a scrap with a group of Americans who were insulting the Stones while they were trying to have a nice meal at Heathrow Airport. Keith knocked out one of the Yanks cold, and although security became involved, no charges were filed. The first known incident of Keith committing an actual crime was on March 18, 1965. The Stones had just played a show at the ABC Cinema in Romford, England. The bill also included a new band called the Hollies and a group called the Conrads, which featured the future David Bowie on vocals. A lot of beer was consumed that night, and the bass player Bill Wyman started complaining that he really needed a bathroom. Ian Stewart, who was driving Mick's brand new car, pulled over at the Francis service station. Wyman tumbled out of the car and asked the attendant, 41-year-old Charles Keeley, if he could use the loo. Charles, however, did not want these hooligans in his gas station and basically told them to shove off. Well, that didn't go well, so Bill, Mick, and Keith relieved themselves against the gas station wall. A small crowd gathered to watch. The Stones loved it, making some rude gestures. The police were called, and eventually everyone was arrested. 2 days later, the news was all over the Daily Express. Keith was among those arrested, but he was not charged. Instead, he was called as a witness, and his testimony was basically, "I didn't see nothing." By this time, though, Keith was starting to get into drugs. It started with alcohol, of course, and then weed sometime in the middle 60s. He was a fan of Mandrax, a highly addictive synthetic sedative, which combined the active ingredients in both Quaaludes and Sopor, which was sold mostly in Europe. LSD was in the mix sometime in 1966, which really wasn't such a big deal because although it had been declared illegal in the US, it was still completely legal to obtain pharmaceutical-grade acid from a lab in Switzerland. Then came cocaine, and then heroin. That will figure into our story later. Keith's next problem with the law was the first of 5 drug-related charges. It came on February 12, 1967. As was fashionable at the time, Keith had purchased an estate in the Sussex countryside called Redlands, a 15th century home. It was here he hoped for peace, quiet, and privacy, the perfect place to write songs and do other things. On that winter Sunday, Keith, his dog, Ratbag, Mick Jagger, Jagger's girlfriend Marianne Faithfull, and several others were sitting around listening to music with incense burning and tripping on LSD. Again, totally legal thing to do at the time. Also there with him that night was a friend named Groovy Bob, an art dealer who had some heroin on him. However, the tabloid The News of the World had been running a series of salacious stories about pop stars on drugs. One such headline read, "Pop stars and hard drugs, facts that will shock you." That's from January 28, 1967. The singer Donovan was hit hard in that one, resulting in a raid on his house along with drug charges. The Who, the Moody Blues, and Cream were all declared degenerate enemies of the people. But it was the Stones, with their bad boy image and them being the de facto face of the dark side of British counterculture, that were the prime target. Someone had also tipped off the tabloid that Jagger was involved in the London drug scene and was often seen at dodgy nightclubs. In a story published on February 5th, the week before the raid at Redlands, the paper claimed that he was taking Benzedrine in public. He'd also flashed some hash and invited friends back to his flat for a smoke. This happened, but they got the wrong Stone. The person involved was actually Brian Jones. This coverage greatly annoyed Jagger because any drug charge could ruin chances for a visa for an upcoming American tour, so he sued the paper. But then, News of the World fired back. They had to prove that they were right about Jagger. So on February 11th, the day before the raid, the paper passed information to the police that Stones were doing all kinds of drugs at Redlands. And this, they said, came directly from an inside informant. The next night, 19 officers, led by Detective Sergeant Norman Pilcher, arrived at Redlands. They knocked on the door and let themselves in. No warrant. They just kind of barged in politely, making a big and loud deal of it in a very English sort of way. They immediately began searching the place, fully expecting to find a huge trove of narcotics. Keith, who had Bob Dylan's Rainy Day Woman numbers 12 and 35 on the stereo at high volume, had to be told repeatedly to take it off. The cops were annoyed at the lyrics, which went, "Well, they'll stone you when you're trying to be so good. They'll stone you just like they said they would. They'll stone you when you're trying to go home, and they'll stone you when you're there all alone. But I would not feel so all alone. Everybody must get stoned." It's really not a drug song, but you can see why the cops were a little upset. As far as the raid goes, all they found were a few amphetamine tablets which Jagger had acquired legally through a prescription in Italy. And there were some traces of some joints in an ashtray. That's it. They never found Groovy Bob's heroin stash. Again, this truth wasn't going to ruin a good tabloid tale. The story became that the cops had actually interrupted an orgy. A woman, and this would be Marianne Faithfull, was said to be completely nude and wrapped in an orange fur bed cover after she apparently and legitimately had taken a bath. There's also a story about a Mars bar that had been inserted in a place where, let's just say that few Mars bars go. Disappointed, the police left. But News of the World was unhappy and ratcheted up all the paranoia around pop stars and their drugs, especially the Rolling Stones. Eventually, charges were filed, with Mick and Keith appearing in court on May 10, 1967. 5 weeks later, they were sentenced. Mick was fined £200 and given a 3-month jail sentence for his amphetamines. Keith, however, was fined £500 for allowing cannabis to be used on his property, along with a year in prison. Both were sent to different jails overnight. However, other newspapers rallied in defense of the Stones, and after some appeals, Jagger was given a conditional discharge, and Keith was freed completely. Meanwhile, the whole ordeal had become a cultural flashpoint across the UK. Drug charge number 1 was defeated, but there would be more, a lot more. Keith Richards' next major run-in with the law happened in 1971. Keith and the Stones had moved to France to escape the punishing tax rates in the UK, which would have seen 93% of their income taken by the government. The move to France was done on the advice of their trusted financial advisor, Prince Rupert Lowenstein. Mick and his girlfriend Bianca found a spot in Biot, a town near Nice. Bill Wyman was in the town of Grasse. Charlie Watts had a nice farm 6 hours away. And Keith moved to Villa Nelcot on the Côte d'Azur. It was a charming place, about 80 years old, that was used by the Gestapo during the German occupation of France in World War II. This is where the Stones' album Exile on Main Street was recorded. The mobile unit was outside, and cables snaked into the sweltering basement. At this point, Keith was using a lot of heroin. The story is that thousands of dollars of smack was being poured into the villa every week. French police eventually found out, and in November 1971, 3 locals were in court, spilling the tea on how they sold all this heroin to Keith. French authorities finally got around to charging Keith and his girlfriend Anita Pallenberg for throwing parties where drugs were used. They were tried in absentia and fined $1,100 each, and were also banned from ever setting foot in France for at least 2 years. This marks the beginning of a residence in Switzerland. Keith had a villa in Montreux. He learned to ski, but the real attraction was the high-quality medical-grade coke that was available in the country. Later, in May 1972, Keith and Mick assaulted a photographer at an airport, and later that month, Anita was arrested at Keith's home in Jamaica on drug charges and held in jail. Keith was worried he was next, but everything was made to go away with an under-the-table payment of $12,000. Keith was then arrested at his home in Chelsea on June 26, 1973. Police found cannabis, some Chinese heroin, weed, cannabis resin, burnt spoons, syringes, pipes, and mandrax in a locked metal box under his 4-poster bed. They also found a loaded handgun. You're supposed to have licenses for such firearms in the UK, and Keith did not. Keith says he bought the gun in San Francisco to use as protection on a trip to Jamaica, and then he had it mailed back to England. There was also the matter of 110 rounds of .22 caliber ammunition. There was also an antique shotgun, but Keith swore he had no idea where that came from. We didn't learn any of the gun charges until the court records were unsealed in 2011. This was bad. Keith was charged with a total of 25 offenses. There was nothing to do but plead guilty at his trial on October 24th, so he did. Also appearing was girlfriend Anita Pallenberg, but she was given a conditional discharge for possession of 25 tablets of mandrax. Keith? Well, he got off easy. 4 conditional discharges and a fine of £205. How? Why? The court was very lenient. It was pointed out that Keith had been a very good boy and was trying to quit drugs. Besides, he was so rich there was no way he had to steal to support his habit. And as for the guns, well, they showed no evidence of ever being fired, so That was somehow a good thing. Besides, guns weren't really Keith's jam. He liked knives. Big, sharp, scary hunting knives. And that caused a problem on July 5th, 1975. Keith and Stones guitarist Ronnie Wood and two Stones employees were driving in a rented Chevy Impala to a gig in Dallas after a gig in Memphis the previous night. They were explicitly told to stick to the interstate and not to travel any back roads where they might run into hostile locals. But of course, Keith did not listen. His route took him through the small town of Fordyce, Arkansas, and they decided to stop for lunch at the Four Dice restaurant. Keith ordered a 16-ounce T-bone and fries. Ronnie ate as much fried chicken from the buffet as he could. They got along well with waitress Wanda Parnell, and they left her a tip of $1.65, which was quite a bit of money in 1975. After lunch, Keith and Ronnie promptly went to the bathroom to get high, and they stayed there for 40 minutes laughing, and as Keith put it, carrying on. Not a good idea for a bunch of long-haired English rock stars. This, of course, was the Bible Belt in the American South. Suspicious staff called the cops, which was a bit weird since Paul Holt, the owner of the restaurant, was a huge Stones fan, but he was back in Memphis where he'd just seen the band the night before. When it was time to leave, Keith got back behind the wheel of the Impala. But a few miles down the road, at around 3 p.m, they were pulled over by a black and white. "You're driving recklessly," said one of the cops. This was a problem. The car was filled with drugs. Keith had a denim cap with interior pockets filled with hash, some prescription drugs, and a little coke. They'd stuffed the door panels with bags of weed, some very pure pharmaceutical cocaine, peyote, and mescaline. And in the trunk was a suitcase full of coke. But what got the cops really suspicious was Keith's big hunting knife lying on the seat. They took that for an illegal concealed weapon. This was the excuse they were looking for, in addition to their contention that they smelled marijuana in the car. They were told to follow the cops to the underground lot beneath City Hall for booking. The cops were ecstatic. There had already been stories of drugs and bad behavior on this current American tour, and they were the ones to get the collar on the Stones. For whatever reason, though, they did not tear the car apart. In fact, now that Keith and Ronnie had been caught, they really didn't know what to do with them. And everyone in the car was able to flush things down the toilet when they were allowed to go to the loo. Meanwhile, word got out, and a crowd was starting to gather in front of City Hall to watch the fun. Eventually, 2,000 people would be outside, which is pretty wild for a town with a population of less than 5,000. Fortunately, the Stones had a well-connected fixer and criminal lawyer named Bill Carter, who, as it happens, was originally from Arkansas. His sole job was to get the Stones, most often Keith, out of trouble. By the time Carter got to Fordyce, he'd formulated a plan. He'd already been on the phone to his pals at the British Embassy in D.C. The cops' testimony regarding evidence was suspect. The prosecutor was fresh out of law school, and the judge, who had been on the golf course all day, was quite drunk. While everyone sat in the hallway, no one was ever put behind bars, and Keith and Ronnie amused themselves by riding bicycles up and down the hallways. Carter went to work. The police chief then tried to arrest the judge for being drunk. There was a scuffle, and in the end, the judge ruled that there was insufficient evidence to charge Keith, Ronnie, and the other two men with anything. In the end, all that stuck was a sketchy, reckless driving charge, which carried a fine of $162.50. That was no problem, because Carter had arrived with a briefcase containing $50,000 in cash. Just in case. There was one more condition for their freedom. Keith and Ronnie had to appear at a press conference with their arms around Judge Wynn. Case closed. Keith would later be pardoned of that charge by Governor McHuckabee on March 9, 2006, which is when the Stones played a gig in Arkansas. The next issue for Keith happened on May 19, 1976. The Stones had just played a show in Stafford, England, and he was driving back to London on the M1 when he crashed his 1965 Bentley Continental Flying Spur, a car that he called Blue Lena. He ran into a tree after falling asleep behind the wheel, and he drifted off the road. The Bentley was banged up, but Keith was okay. There were other people in the car too, but they were okay too. Keith's son Marlon was in the back seat, but he was uninjured. When police showed up, they found suspicious substances both in Keith's jacket and in the car. There was a lot of coke and weed. You see, Blue Lena had been modified with a secret compartment designed specifically for carrying drugs. Keith was merely fined £750 plus £250 in court costs for possession of cocaine. There was a charge of possession of LSD, but he beat that rap. Good thing too, because things between Keith and the Stones were at a pretty low point at this time, largely because of his drug use. By the way, Blue Lena would later be sold at auction in 2015. Someone paid $1,186,133 for it. This, by the way, was the same car used for a drug trip to Morocco after the Redlands incident in 1967, so a lot of history with that car. Keith and Anita continued to use, and his intake spiked after June 1976. And this is tragic. In February, Keith and Anita had another son, Tara Jojo Gunn Richards. But while Keith was on tour with the Stones in Paris, Tara died of sudden infant death syndrome. The little guy wasn't even 3 months old. Keith says that had the band not rallied to help him, he would have shot himself that night. Then came the Canadian incident. And this one was bad. Really, really, really bad. That story is next. The next story in the episode of The Life and Crimes of Keith Richards takes us back to early March 1977. By this time, Keith had been busted for drugs multiple times, and despite a few close calls, never had to serve any real time in jail. But this time, it looked like his luck had run out. Keith had tried to clean up many times, but he always slipped back into drugs. Heroin was definitely his main thing now, and girlfriend Anita Pallenberg was right there with him. Keith's new friend was John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas. He'd moved to London and quickly hooked up with Keith. And one day in February 77, he came around with a bottle of something called Merc, which was very high-grade pharmaceutical cocaine. Very powerful. Keith took some, and then he took some more, and some more after that. That Merc Coke kept Keith awake for 8 straight days. He was writing songs for what would become the Some Girls album, and during this binge, he arranged for 2 engineers in the studio. Every 12 hours, one would go for a nap under the console while the other worked. Meanwhile, Keith just kept going. On the 9th day, his body gave out. He fell into a big JBL speaker at his house, bloodied his nose, and fell asleep on the floor, where he remained for at least 24 hours. When he recovered, Keith had to get to Toronto. The Stones were rehearsing and had booked the El Macombo, a 300-person club, to record a live album under the name The Cockroaches. 2 so-called secret shows were scheduled and were supposed to be for special contest winners only. Keith and Anita flew to Toronto on February 24th, 1977. On the way over, he took a hit on the plane, and somehow the spoon ended up in Anita's pocket. Problems began at customs. Anita was arrested because traces of heroin were found on that spoon. And then traces of heroin were found in her luggage. They also found 10 grams of hash. This was just the start. Toronto cops had prepared a special welcome for Keith at his hotel, the Harbour Castle Hilton. On February 27th, police moved in, acting on some kind of tip that more drugs would be found in Keith and Anita's room. They'd intercepted a package of dope that had been mailed to the hotel ahead of time, and Keith had also secured some dope in one of his equipment flight cases. The cops made their way to Keith's door, all dressed as waiters, so as to not arouse any suspicion. They knocked on the door of his suite, and Marlon, his son, answered the door. He thought it was room service. I mean, why not? They were all dressed as waiters. But they were cops, and they were there to arrest Keith. However, they couldn't wake him up, and you just can't haul away someone if they're sleeping. You have to be conscious to understand that you're being arrested. At this point, Keith had been awake for another 5 straight days and had just taken a big hit of heroin to come down. As they tried to wake Keith, they turned the suite upside down. There was about an ounce of heroin, 22 grams to be exact, and that's a lot. Here's Keith. That took them about 2 hours to drag me out. Pow, pow! I woke up with like rosy cheeks. "Oh, he's awake. You're under arrest." "Oh, great." I looked at the old lady and said, "I'll see you in about 7 years, babe." Meanwhile, the commotion attracted attention from other guests. 29-year-old Margaret Trudeau, who had become friends with Mick, was seen looking concerned in the hallway wearing just her bathrobe. Fun fact, she was there at the same time as her 6th wedding anniversary to Pierre. Because of the amount of cocaine, Keith was charged with intent to traffic, which is crazy, of course, because all that smack was meant for Keith. But if he was convicted, he did face up to 7 years in jail. Keith was taken to a police station, booked, released, and confined to the hotel. He could only leave to play the shows at the El Mocambo on March 4th and 5th. You can imagine the pall over the group during this period. As soon as the shows were over, the band left town. Except for Keith, of course. On March 8th, Keith was in court again because, after going through his room again, they found 5 grams of coke. That caused his initial bail to be revoked. But by this time, Bill Carter was there, doing his best to fix things, and he got Keith off on a technicality. Keith was able to leave Toronto after posting a bond of $25,000, and Carter also managed to convince authorities that Keith's addiction constituted a genuine medical problem and should be treated as such. At this point, Keith, Bill Carter, and all his other lawyers were pretty sure that there was no way out of this one. Keith was looking at 2 years minimum. To pass the time, Keith found a studio and recorded some songs, and that collection still circulates under the title KR's Toronto Bootlegs. By April 1st, he was free to move about a little more. His passport was returned, and he received a medical visa to visit the Stevens Psychiatric Center in New York City. The detox treatment consisted of passing an electric current through his body via the earlobes, and plenty of Jack Daniels as a diversion from the heroin. This worked well enough for Keith's visas to be extended, and he was allowed to stay in the U.S., living in a rented house in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, where he waited for the Toronto situation to play out. And he waited for 19 months. Meanwhile, the Stones went ahead with recording the Some Girls album in Paris. At least that went well. They wrote songs every day, resulting in future hits like Miss You, Beast of Burden, Shattered, When the Whip Comes Down, and Respectable. However, Keith was not clean. He'd spend his time in the bathroom shooting up between takes. Keith was in and out of Toronto for a long time as his lawyers worked on the case. He had a private plane that took him back and forth from New York. Keith Richards' drug trafficking trial began on October 23, 1978. The cops thought they had an airtight case. Pierre and Maggie Trudeau were a little nervous about the blowback they might have to endure because of whatever Maggie had been doing with the Stones. Meanwhile, the Canadian government wasn't keen on how things were playing out. When his lawyers stood before Judge Lloyd Grayburn, they gave this testimony. This arrest was a wake-up call for their client. He realized that he was ill, suffering from addiction, a genuine medical condition. Their client was now clean and sober. He never intended to sell those drugs, so the trafficking charge was unwarranted. Various people testified on Keith's behalf, including Lorne Michaels, the producer of Saturday Night Live. Dan Aykroyd did the same. Meanwhile, it appears that the Trudeau government may have been sending signals demanding that this whole thing be wrapped up rather quickly. On October 24th, Keith appeared in court wearing a 3-piece suit and tie. Everyone stood when the judge entered the room and delivered the verdict. "Guilty," he said. Oh no. But then he continued. "However, I will not incarcerate him for addiction and wealth." This greatly disappointed prosecutor Paul Kennedy, who had been asking for between 6 and 12 months of jail time. However, Keith wasn't exactly going to walk free. There had to be some kind of reparations and punishment. The judge imposed a single condition, that Keith play a charity concert, and he was very specific. This charity concert had to be for the Canadian National Institute of the Blind. Okay, that's interesting. Why them? This brings us to the story of Rita Bedard. She was a Stones superfan who just happened to be blind. But despite that, Rita was always hitchhiking to Stones shows. Eventually, Keith heard about her and arranged for her to move from gig to gig with the Rolling Stones roadies. She was fed and cared for, and now she wanted to return the favor. Rita found out where Judge Grayburn lived. She rang the doorbell and proceeded with a passionate defense of Keith. This is what moved the judge. "If you jail Keith, you will be doing a disservice to music fans around the world." The argument worked. Keith's official sentence was 1 year probation and 2 benefit concerts for the CNIB that had to be staged within 6 months. This satisfied everyone, including the prosecutor who told the press, "Well, at least I got a Rolling Stone off drugs." Both concerts were held at the Oshawa Civic Auditorium on April 29, 1979. Tickets went on sale just 6 days before the shows, and demand was insane. 5,000 people were at each performance. Keith, Mick, the Stones, and Ronnie Wood's band, the New Barbarians, were there. And John Belushi was there. He introduced the evening.
Yay! Woo! Woo! Greetings from fellow Canadian Dan Aykroyd. All right, I don't know if you know who I work on a sleazy late-night TV show on Saturday. And I did a movie and an album with Dan Aykroyd, fellow Canadian. And he's in the Bahamas, the lazy bastard. And he told me to tell you to all go nuts tonight. Now, this band is coming up. The opening act used to be called, they were going to call it New Vegetarians, and they bit into a steak, and they're called New Barbarians, the opening act.
Each set featured 10 songs, ending with Jumpin' Jack Flash. There was never any appeal to Keith's sentence. Keith was free, and he was clean. And it was all good forevermore after that, right? Well, no. This is just part 1 of the life and crimes of Keith Richards, and there is still plenty more weirdness to come. And we'll deal with that on the next episode of Uncharted Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. Until then, you can get caught up on all the previous episodes. They're available for free where you download podcasts. And if you want more, there's my other podcast that looks at the entire universe of alt-rock called The Ongoing History of New Music, and there are hundreds and hundreds of episodes available, all for free. I'd love to see you over at my website. It's a journalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and information every day. There's a free newsletter that goes along with it, and we'll probably run into each other on all kinds of social media platforms. Email can go to alan@alancross.ca, and I promise to personally respond. Technical production for Uncharted is by Rob Johnston. New shows come every 2 weeks. Talk to you next time for part 2 of the life and crimes of Keith Richards. I'm Alan Cross.